There is a moment your soulmate has recently experienced that they cannot explain away anymore. Something shifted inside them, quietly but deeply, and although you may not have seen any obvious change from the outside, their entire perspective on this connection has begun to move in a different direction. For a long time, they may have convinced themselves that the distance between you was necessary, that silence would eventually make the feelings disappear, or that enough time would allow them to place this connection somewhere safely in their past. They tried to continue with life as though everything had already been decided. But something unexpected happened. A memory returned with a completely different emotional weight. Perhaps it was a familiar place, a song, a conversation, or even a quiet moment when they suddenly realized that they were still carrying emotions they thought they had already released. And that realization unsettled them, because they had believed they were finally becoming detached. Instead, they discovered that something about you still had a place inside them that time had failed to erase. Now your soulmate has started looking at the past with a different kind of honesty. They are no longer asking only why things went wrong. They are beginning to ask why, despite everything that happened, their heart never completely stopped returning to you. Why did certain memories remain so vivid? Why did thoughts of you appear during moments when they were supposedly moving forward? Why did they still feel something whenever your name, your presence, or anything connected to you unexpectedly entered their mind? These questions are becoming difficult for them to ignore because the answers are forcing them to reconsider a conclusion they once believed was final. And this is where the turning point truly begins. Your soulmate is realizing that moving forward and moving on are not always the same thing. They may have continued living their life, but emotionally, a part of them remained connected to what was left unresolved between you. What once felt like an old chapter is beginning to feel like a story that was interrupted before its meaning was fully understood. And the more they recognize this, the more they understand that their previous silence may not have been proof that they stopped caring. It may have been their way of avoiding feelings they were not ready to confront. Something inside them is now asking for honesty, and for the first time, they are listening. Because the turning point is not simply that they remembered you again. It is that they finally realized they never truly forgot what this connection meant to them. What your soulmate is beginning to understand now goes much deeper than simply realizing that they still think about you. The real shift is happening because they are finally questioning why they were never able to completely release the emotional connection they had with you. For a long time, they may have interpreted those returning memories as weakness, nostalgia, or simply the mind holding on to something familiar. Whenever thoughts of you appeared, they tried to push them aside. Whenever a memory became too emotional, they distracted themselves. Whenever they felt that quiet pull toward you, they reminded themselves of all the reasons why things had become complicated. But lately, those explanations are no longer satisfying them. Something has changed in the way they look at those memories. Instead of immediately trying to escape them, they are allowing themselves to sit with them, and in doing so, they are discovering something they were not prepared to admit. The feelings connected to you were never as temporary as they tried to believe. There were moments they thought they had forgotten completely, yet suddenly those moments return with remarkable clarity. A particular conversation, the way you looked at them during a certain moment, something you said that seemed ordinary at the time, or even a small detail about your presence can unexpectedly bring an entire memory back. And what surprises them is not the memory itself. It is the emotion attached to it. They can still feel something. That realization has made them wonder whether they were ever truly moving on or simply learning how to live without acknowledging what remained unresolved inside them. Because your heart needs to understand this, your soulmate is beginning to separate two things they once confused with each other, letting go of a person and accepting the truth of what they felt for that person. They may have created distance. They may have remained silent, They may have convinced themselves that circumstances had closed the door, but none of those things necessarily meant their heart had reached the same conclusion. In fact, the more they look back, the more they notice how often their feelings continued appearing beneath the surface. Even when they were distracted, something would remind them of you. Even when they believed they had accepted the situation, another memory would quietly return. Even when they tried to imagine a completely different future, some part of them would wonder what might have happened if they had made different choices. And now they are beginning to recognize that these thoughts were not random interruptions. They were signs that something within them remained unfinished. Listen carefully, because this is where their realization becomes much more personal. Your soulmate is starting to understand that they did not simply miss your presence. They missed the version of themselves they experienced around you. There may have been a sense of openness, comfort, excitement, vulnerability, or emotional honesty that they have struggled to recreate elsewhere. They are remembering not only what you gave them, but how deeply the connection made them feel. This is why moving forward may have been more difficult than they expected. They could replace routines. They could meet new people. They could fill their days with responsibilities and distractions. But they could not easily replace the emotional imprint that this connection left behind. And that realization has created a quiet conflict within them. Part of them wishes they had understood this sooner, while another part is afraid of what acknowledging it now might require. They are beginning to see that some of the decisions they made in the past were based more on fear, uncertainty, or the desire to protect themselves than on what their heart genuinely wanted. They may now be replaying certain moments and wondering whether they interpreted them incorrectly. They may remember times when they pulled away, just when closeness was beginning to develop. Moments when they remained silent instead of speaking honestly. Or opportunities when they could have chosen vulnerability but chose distance instead. These memories are becoming more meaningful because they are no longer viewing them through the same emotional lens. And with every realization, one question becomes stronger. If their feelings were truly gone, why does their heart still react so strongly whenever you return to their thoughts? That question is changing everything. Your soulmate is slowly realizing that the connection was not difficult to forget because they were weak. It was difficult because something about it mattered deeply to them. And once they accept that truth, they can no longer pretend that the past means nothing. They are beginning to understand why certain memories survived, why certain emotions remained, and why some part of them kept looking back even while trying to move forward. The turning point that began with a single realization is now becoming something much larger. They are not simply remembering you anymore. They are finally beginning to understand why they could never completely let you go. And now your soulmate is being forced to confront something they spent a long time avoiding, and this may be the most uncomfortable part of their entire realization. Understanding that their feelings never truly disappeared is one thing, but understanding why they allowed those feelings to remain unspoken is something completely different. For a long time, your soulmate may have believed that circumstances were the main reason things never moved forward. They may have blamed timing, distance, responsibilities, misunderstandings, or everything happening around them. And while some of those circumstances may have been real, they are beginning to recognize that there was another force influencing their choices all along. Fear. Not necessarily fear of you, but fear of what would happen if they allowed themselves to become completely honest about what they felt. Because your heart needs to understand this. Sometimes a person can deeply care about someone and still create distance because the connection asks them to become vulnerable in ways they are not prepared for. Your soulmate is beginning to see that this may have been part of their story. They may have been afraid of being rejected, afraid of getting hurt, afraid of losing control, or afraid that opening their heart would create consequences they did not know how to handle. Perhaps they were afraid that you no longer felt the same way. Perhaps they worried that too much time had passed. Perhaps they convinced themselves that staying silent was safer than risking an answer they might not be ready to hear. Whatever form that fear took, it gave them reasons to delay what their heart was asking them to confront. And recently, they have begun recognizing how often fear disguised itself as logic. They told themselves they were being practical when they were actually protecting themselves. They told themselves they were waiting for the right moment when, deep down, they were afraid to make the first move. They told themselves that silence was necessary when perhaps silence was simply easier than honesty. This realization has been difficult because it requires them to take responsibility for their own choices. They can no longer place every unanswered question on circumstances or other people. They are beginning to understand that some doors remained closed because they were the ones too afraid to reach for the handle. And listen carefully, because this is where their emotions become even deeper. Your soulmate may now be thinking about the moments when they had an opportunity to express themselves, but chose not to. They may remember words they wanted to say, but swallowed. They may remember moments when they wanted to reach out, but convinced themselves that it was better to wait. They may remember seeing an opening for connection and allowing it to pass because they were uncertain about what would happen next. At the time, those choices probably felt temporary. Now they may look very different. With distance and reflection, your soulmate is beginning to understand that every delay changed the story in some way. Every hesitation created another layer of distance. Every unspoken feeling became another unanswered question. And this realization can bring a quiet form of regret. Not the kind that destroys them, but the kind that makes them wonder how different everything could have been if they had trusted their heart earlier. They are beginning to ask themselves a question they cannot easily escape. What if they had been brave when it mattered most? What if they had stopped overthinking and simply admitted what they felt? What if the connection was never asking them to have all the answers, but only asking them to be honest? These questions are becoming increasingly powerful because your soulmate is realizing that waiting for perfect certainty may have cost them opportunities that could never be recreated in exactly the same way. And yet, there is something hopeful hidden inside this realization. They are beginning to understand that regret does not have to become another reason to remain stuck. The past cannot be changed, but the pattern can be changed. They cannot return to every moment where they hesitated, but they can decide not to keep repeating the same behavior. This is where the turning point becomes real. Your soulmate is no longer only looking backward and asking why they behaved the way they did. They are beginning to look forward and ask what they are going to do differently now. That question carries a completely different energy because it shifts them from reflection into possibility. They are beginning to understand that remaining undecided is also a decision, and continuing to run from what they feel will not make the feeling disappear. Something inside them is becoming tired of hiding behind uncertainty. They may still have fears, and they may still have questions, but the difference now is that fear no longer feels powerful enough to completely silence their heart. The person who once needed every circumstance to be perfect before taking a step is beginning to realize that sometimes courage means taking a step while uncertainty still exists. And this is why the turning point between you two is becoming so significant. Your soulmate is not simply discovering what they feel. They are beginning to recognize that they have a choice about what they do with those feelings. For the first time, the possibility of staying silent may feel more painful than the possibility of finally being honest. And once someone reaches that point, they can no longer look at the connection exactly the way they did before. Something has changed in the way your soulmate is thinking about the future. Because, after everything they have recently realized, they are no longer comfortable imagining that the story between you simply ends where it currently stands. For a long time, they may have believed that the safest option was to leave everything untouched. They could keep their distance, avoid difficult conversations, and allow time to make the decisions for them. But now that they have confronted their own feelings and recognized the fear that influenced so many of their choices, remaining passive is beginning to feel different. What once felt like protection now feels like avoidance. Your soulmate is starting to understand that if they truly want a different outcome, they cannot continue repeating the same patterns that created the distance in the first place. And this realization has quietly changed the questions they ask themselves. Before, their thoughts may have sounded like, what if this doesn't work? What if I get hurt? Or what if too much has already happened? But now another question is becoming louder. What if I never give this connection a genuine chance? That question has the power to change everything because it moves their attention away from fear and toward possibility. They are beginning to realize that they have spent so much time imagining everything that could go wrong that they never allowed themselves to consider what could go right. Because your heart needs to understand this, your soulmate is not necessarily expecting everything to become easy overnight. They are simply becoming more willing to acknowledge that something meaningful deserves to be approached with honesty rather than fear. This is why their perspective on you is changing as well. They are no longer looking only at the complications that surrounded the connection. They are remembering the emotional truth underneath those complications. They are remembering how natural certain moments felt, how deeply certain conversations affected them, and how difficult it became to completely disconnect even when they tried. Those memories are giving them a different understanding of what happened between you. What once looked like a connection that failed may now look more like a connection that was interrupted by circumstances, hesitation, and choices that were made before both of you fully understood what was happening. And this realization is creating a quiet sense of possibility inside them. They may find themselves imagining what an honest conversation with you would feel like. They may wonder how you would react if they finally said what they kept inside. They may think about what would happen if they stopped trying to predict the outcome and simply allowed themselves to be truthful. These thoughts are important because they show that your soulmate is moving from emotional reflection into emotional readiness. They are no longer asking whether they should continue pretending they feel nothing. They are asking what it would mean to finally respect what they actually feel. Listen carefully, because this is where the energy of the entire connection begins to shift. A true turning point does not always arrive with a dramatic announcement or an obvious external event. Sometimes it begins in complete silence, inside the mind of someone who suddenly realizes that they cannot continue living according to an old version of themselves. Your soulmate is beginning to reach that point. The person who once avoided difficult emotions is becoming more willing to face them. The person who once waited for certainty is beginning to understand that certainty may never come before courage. The person who once allowed fear to make decisions is beginning to question whether fear deserves that much authority over their future. And as this internal change grows stronger, they are beginning to understand something else. They cannot change the past, but they can stop allowing the past to dictate every decision they make from this moment forward. That realization brings a different kind of strength. It does not erase their fears, but it changes their relationship with those fears. They may still wonder whether you would accept them, whether too much time has passed, or whether circumstances could become complicated again. But instead of using those questions as reasons to disappear, they are beginning to see them as questions that can only be answered through honesty. And this is the point where the connection begins entering unfamiliar territory. Your soulmate is no longer emotionally standing at the same place where they once stood. Something inside them has moved. Their perspective has matured. Their understanding has deepened. Their heart is asking for a choice rather than another delay. They are beginning to recognize that if they continue doing nothing, they may eventually have to live with the knowledge that fear made the decision for them. And that possibility is becoming harder to accept. So even if the outside world has not yet revealed the full result of this internal transformation, something important has already happened. Your soulmate has stopped seeing this connection as something they simply have to accept or forget. They are beginning to see it as something they must honestly decide what to do with. And once that realization settles deeply enough, the next step is no longer about whether they feel something for you. The real question becomes whether they are finally brave enough to act differently because of what they now know. And now your soulmate has reached the point where the realization can no longer remain only inside their thoughts, because everything they have discovered about themselves has brought them to one final truth. They cannot change the moments when they were afraid. They cannot rewrite the conversations they left unfinished. And they cannot return to every opportunity they allowed to pass. But they can decide what those experiences mean from this moment forward. For a long time, they may have believed that the biggest problem between you was the distance itself, the silence, the timing, or everything that seemed to stand in the way. But now they are beginning to understand that the deeper problem was never simply the distance. It was the way fear taught them to respond to something they genuinely cared about. And this realization is changing the way they see the entire connection. Your soulmate is no longer asking themselves whether they should forget you. They are asking whether they are willing to keep pretending that forgetting you is what their heart truly wants. That is a very different question, and it is one they can no longer avoid. Because your heart needs to hear this, the turning point is not necessarily about one dramatic moment appearing overnight. It is about an internal decision becoming stronger than the reasons that once kept them stuck. They have reached a place where silence does not feel as safe as it once did. Distance does not feel as satisfying as it once did. And pretending that everything is finished does not bring the same sense of peace anymore. Somewhere within them, they have begun to understand that unresolved feelings do not disappear simply because a person refuses to speak about them. Sometimes they become quieter, but they remain present, waiting for the courage to finally acknowledge them. Your soulmate is beginning to recognize that what remained between you was not simply an attachment to the past. It was an emotional truth they never fully gave themselves permission to explore. And now that they have stopped fighting that truth, they are seeing the connection through a completely different lens. They are remembering the moments that felt genuine. They are thinking about the parts of you that stayed with them long after circumstances changed. They are realizing that even during periods when they appeared distant, some part of them continued carrying the connection internally. That understanding is creating both vulnerability and strength. Vulnerability because acknowledging what they feel means they can no longer hide behind uncertainty. Strength because they are finally becoming honest enough to accept that their heart has been trying to tell them something for a long time. And listen carefully, because this is where the real transformation becomes visible within them. They are beginning to understand that the future cannot be built by constantly protecting themselves from every possible disappointment. At some point they have to decide what matters enough to take an emotional risk for. And this connection has reached that point in their mind. They may still have questions about timing, circumstances, or how you would respond, but those questions are no longer automatically becoming reasons to walk away. Instead, they are becoming things they may eventually need to face with honesty. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that courage does not mean knowing exactly how everything will unfold. Courage means refusing to let fear make the decision before the heart has even been heard. And that is the person they are slowly becoming. They are no longer exactly the person who walked away, stayed silent, or convinced themselves that distance would solve everything. Something inside them has matured through the time apart. They have learned what absence feels like. They have learned what it means to carry an unfinished emotion. They have learned that distractions cannot permanently replace genuine emotional connection. Most importantly, they have learned that avoiding a feeling is not the same as resolving it. So when they think about you now, they are not simply remembering the past. They are beginning to wonder about the possibility of a different future. And that is why this turning point matters so much. The connection may not instantly transform into the outcome you have been hoping for, but the internal story has changed. Your soulmate has moved from denial toward acceptance, from fear toward honesty, and from passive waiting toward the possibility of making a conscious choice. The biggest realization is that they no longer want their future to be determined by the same fears that shaped their past. And if there is one truth they are carrying with them now, it is this: what was genuine between you did not disappear simply because life became complicated. It remained beneath the silence, beneath the distance, and beneath everything they used to convince themselves it was over. Now they finally understand that the turning point was never about changing the past. It was about changing what they are willing to do with the truth they discovered. And somewhere deep within them, they know that if their heart keeps leading them back to the same connection, eventually they will have to stop running from it and start listening to what it has been saying all along.